While inspecting storm damage deep in the Rockies, combat veteran-turned-forest ranger Daniel Walker thought he was tracking poachers. But his loyal German shepherd, Max, sensed something far worse, something buried beneath the snow. What Daniel found wasn't a hunter's trap, but a small blood-stained bracelet half frozen in the dirt beside heavy tire tracks. The forest went silent. Then, from somewhere deep between the trees, came the faint echo of a child's cry. In that moment, Daniel realized the mountain wasn't hiding a crime against nature. It was hiding a crime against humanity. Please support us by subscribing to the channel for more true-to-life stories of courage, faith, and redemption. Early winter light brushed the Rocky Mountains with a soft, white glow. Frost coated every branch, and the cold air carried the faint scent of pine and wood smoke. Daniel Walker stood outside his log cabin, boots half buried in snow, a steaming mug of black coffee warming his scarred hands. He was 48 years old, tall and lean, with dark brown hair streaked gray at the temples. His face was all hard lines and quiet endurance, weathered by years of sand, wind, and guilt. A pale scar cut across his left cheek, a relic of shrapnel and survival. His steel blue eyes, deep and distant, scanned the ridgeline like a soldier still expecting trouble. Daniel had once been part of the Special Forces in the Middle East. He'd lived through ambushes, dust storms, and the unending tremor of fear that hummed beneath every heartbeat. When he finally left the service, the noise of cities felt too loud, too false. So he ran, to the high wilds of Colorado, to a place where silence reigned. The cabin was small, walls made of pine and loneliness. He told himself he'd come for peace, but the truth was simpler. He couldn't stand to be around people anymore. The war had taken too much from him. Brothers, sleep, faith, and what it left behind was a man who trusted quiet more than words. At his side sat Max, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a thick black and tan coat and intelligent amber eyes. A faint scar on his hind leg told its own story, the night he dragged Daniel out of burning debris in Helmand Province. They had been inseparable ever since, two soldiers bound by survival. Max was disciplined, calm, and far too perceptive for a dog. Sometimes Daniel thought the animal carried the same invisible wounds he did, the kind that didn't bleed but never healed. He finished his coffee and set the mug on the porch rail. The forest before him stretched endless and still, the pines wrapped in fog, the air sharp as broken glass. He pulled on his worn olive ranger jacket, checked the radio strapped to his belt, and whistled softly. Max's ears twitched, his tail swayed once in silent readiness. They began their morning patrol, a ritual that kept Daniel's mind anchored. Down the ridge, along the frozen creek, circle back by noon. Routine meant control, and control meant he could breathe. They moved through the trees with quiet precision. Daniel's boots crunched over ice and dead needles. Max trotted ahead, nose close to the ground. The forest was alive with small sounds, the creak of bark, the distant crack of settling snow, a single raven calling somewhere beyond sight. To anyone else it might have been peace. To Daniel, it was vigilance. Every shift of wind made him tense. Every shadow drew his eyes. He couldn't turn it off. He had been trained to notice what others missed. Sometimes he hated it. Sometimes it was all that kept him sane. They reached the creek, a thin sheet of ice glazed over black water. Daniel knelt, brushed snow aside, and touched the surface. The cold stung his fingers, grounding him. He looked up toward the ridgeline, white against a gray sky, and for a moment thought he saw smoke rising between the pines. He frowned. There were no cabins for miles, no campsites either. Maybe an old campfire, reigniting, maybe his imagination. He pushed the thought away, but unease crept under his skin like frostbite. As they continued, Max's behavior changed. His pace slowed, his body stiffened, and his nose pressed deep into the snow. Daniel noticed instantly. "What is it, boy?" The dog ignored him, circling a patch of disturbed ground. His ears pricked, his tail straightened. Then, without warning, Max began to dig. Snow and dirt flew behind him in frantic bursts. Daniel sighed, thinking it might be a frozen carcass or some hunter's leftover bait. "Leave it," he ordered, but Max didn't stop. Instead, he let out a low growl, one Daniel hadn't heard since Afghanistan. Daniel crouched beside him. Something metallic caught the light beneath the churned snow. He brushed it clear, the cold biting through his glove. It was a small bracelet, silver, bent, and stained with something dark. Tiny pink beads spelled out the name, Emma. His breath hitched. For a long moment he simply stared, the world narrowing to that fragile blood-streaked thing in his palm. Max whined softly, eyes flicking toward the trees. Daniel followed his gaze. That's when he saw them. Deep tire tracks carved into the snow, wide and heavy, leading toward the restricted part of the forest. The marks were fresh, the edges still sharp. He straightened slowly, scanning the tree line. Whoever had been here came through recently, and in this weather, that meant purpose. He looked down at the bracelet again, then back to Max. "This doesn't belong out here." The words felt heavy, too loud in the quiet air. He slipped the bracelet into his jacket pocket, the metal cold against his chest. A familiar pressure built behind his ribs, the same feeling he'd had before missions, that quiet certainty that something was about to go wrong. The wind shifted, carrying the faintest echo of engine oil and burnt rubber. Max's ears flicked, his body tense again. Daniel's instincts roared awake, every nerve lit with focus. "Easy," he whispered, though the word was more for himself than the dog. He scanned the trail, reading the scene like a map. Tire marks, disturbed earth, scattered branches. A vehicle had struggled here recently, maybe last night. The ground near the tracks was darker, the snow mixed with something brownish-red. He knelt again, brushing the dirt aside. The stain was old enough to freeze, but fresh enough to hold color. Blood. He closed his eyes briefly, exhaling through his teeth. "Damn it!" Max barked once, sharp and warning, the sound cracking through the trees. The forest swallowed the echo, then went utterly silent. Daniel's breath hung in the air. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across the endless pines. There was nothing to see, but the feeling was undeniable, the sense that they were not alone. He rose, wiped his gloved hands on his jacket, and gave Max a quiet nod. "Let's head back." But as he said it, his eyes lingered on the tracks, following them into the mist. The forest seemed to lean closer, holding its breath. He touched the scar on his cheek, a reflex born of memory, and whispered, almost to himself, "Something's wrong here." With the bracelet heavy in his pocket and the snow beginning to fall harder, Daniel turned toward the valley. Max followed at his side, ears alert, paws leaving new prints beside his master's. Behind them, the wind swept over the disturbed ground, slowly covering the tracks and the stain beneath. Yet the feeling remained, an unseen presence in the trees, watching, waiting, as if the mountain itself was guarding a secret that refused to stay buried. Morning fog still clung to the Rockies when Daniel Walker steered his rusted green pickup down the twisting road toward Pine Creek. The forest gave way to frost-covered fields, and smoke from chimneys drifted into a sky the color of cold steel. Max sat upright in the passenger seat, a silent shadow with amber eyes scanning every curve. Daniel's gloved hand tightened on the steering wheel as the town appeared, a small grid of streets surrounded by mountains like silent sentinels. Pine Creek looked peaceful. Too peaceful, the kind of place that smiled for strangers but locked its doors at night. The sheriff's office stood near the corner of Main Street. A beige brick cube with a peeling flag and a dusty cruiser parked out front. Inside, heat blasted from a vent that smelled of old coffee. Sheriff Harold Coleman, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-50s with silvered hair slicked back and eyes the color of ice, looked up briefly from his desk. His uniform strained against a soft belly. His badge gleamed, though his expression did not. Daniel placed the silver bracelet and a printed photograph of tire tracks on the counter. "Found these near the North Ridge," he said evenly. "The snow's fresh, so the vehicle passed through last night. The stain on this metal isn't rust, it's blood." Coleman leaned back in his chair, unimpressed. "Probably fell from some tourist," he replied. "And those tracks, delivery trucks use that road all the time." Daniel's jaw hardened. "That section's closed to the public." Coleman's sigh was heavy, almost theatrical. "Then they took a wrong turn. Don't stir things up, Ranger. Folks here like quiet." He handed the bracelet back, his pale eyes narrowing. "Let the mountain bury its own ghosts." Daniel pocketed the bracelet, a muscle twitching near his scar. Years of command discipline kept his voice calm, but inside the pulse of anger rose. He had seen men hide atrocities under softer excuses than this. "If a child's missing," he said quietly, "that's not just the mountain's business." Coleman's mouth curled in a thin smile. "No missing child's been reported." The words rang false. Daniel could hear the hollow certainty of bureaucracy, the same tone he'd once heard from officers who denied casualties because paperwork was easier than truth. He turned without another word, Max padding close beside him, tail low, ears tense. As the door shut behind them, Daniel felt the cold air slice through the warmth of the office like an accusation. Across the street, the Bluefinch Cafe glowed in the dull light, a rectangle of fogged windows and the smell of bacon. Daniel entered, shaking off snow, and slid onto a stool by the counter. Max lay near his boots, head resting on his paws. The waitress poured him coffee without asking. Habit, not kindness. The town had long learned to keep distance from the man who preferred the mountains to company. He sipped slowly, trying to puzzle the sheriff's indifference when the doorbell jingled again. A woman stepped in, brushing frost from her hair. She was in her early 30s, tall, slender, wrapped in a long wool coat whose elbows had thinned with years of use. Her chestnut hair was braided loosely, and her green-gray eyes carried that raw mix of exhaustion and defiance Daniel recognized in soldiers who refused to give up. She carried a small stack of missing person flyers, the corners creased from overuse. She began pinning one to the bulletin board. Daniel's voice was quiet but steady. "Missing person?" She turned, startled, then nodded. "My sister, Emily Carter, 12 years old. She disappeared 3 days ago near the mountain trails." Her tone wavered only slightly as she handed him a flyer. The girl's photo stared up, a freckled child with brown hair and a hesitant smile. Beneath it, the description read, "Last seen wearing a pink beaded bracelet." Daniel's hand moved to his jacket pocket. Slowly, he withdrew the silver bracelet still smudged with dirt and time. "You mean this one?" The woman's eyes widened. Her fingers trembled as she touched it. "That's hers," she whispered, voice breaking. "Where did you find it?" "Near the ridge," he said softly, "next to fresh truck tracks." Tears slid down her cheeks, though her jaw stayed tight, as if she'd vowed not to let grief become weakness. Around them, the cafe grew silent, every conversation dying mid-sentence. Then a child's voice rose from a booth by the window. "I saw trucks there, too." Daniel turned to see a boy, perhaps 12, with tousled blonde hair and a second-hand blue jacket far too big for his frame. Across from him sat an elderly woman whose thin hands clutched his wrist. The boy swallowed before speaking again. "They go up the old mine road every night. 4 or 5 of them. Big trucks. I can see their lights from my window." Daniel stepped closer. "What mine road?" The boy's eyes darted toward his grandmother. "Silver Hollow," he whispered. "Grandma says it's closed, but they still go there." The woman's face tightened. Her hair was white, her skin papery, but her voice was firm. "Ethan, enough. You don't know what you're saying." Fear, not scolding, shaped her tone. Daniel met her gaze and saw it clearly. the fear of someone who'd learned that silence was safer than truth. "Ma'am," he said gently, "has anyone else seen them?" She shook her head too quickly. "People mind their business here. You should too." The words fell like stones. Daniel felt Max's body stiffen under the table, ears tilting toward the window as if the dog sensed the unease in the room. The woman, named Lily Carter, stood beside him, clutching the bracelet so tightly her knuckles whitened. "Silver Hollow's been abandoned for 20 years, she murmured. "My father worked there before the collapse. They sealed it off after the flood." Her eyes lifted to Daniel's, brimming with determination. "If trucks are going there again, someone's hiding something." Daniel nodded slowly, the soldier's instinct rising. Pattern, motive, opportunity. "Then that's where I'll look." Lily caught his arm. "Be careful. If the sheriff's pretending not to see, there's a reason." He gave a faint, humorless smile. "Ma'am, I stopped trusting reasons a long time ago." Snow had begun to fall outside, wind scraping through the street like a whisper of warning. Daniel rose, adjusting his worn denim jacket. Max stood instantly, muscles taut, gaze fixed on the mountains that loomed above the town. In the window's reflection, man and dog appeared like twin silhouettes, one scarred by war, the other by loyalty. Daniel placed a few bills beside his untouched coffee and turned to the door. The bell above it chimed softly as he stepped into the swirling snow. Behind him, the murmur of Pine Creek resumed, quieter now, as if the town itself exhaled in relief to see him leave. But Daniel knew that peace built on denial never lasted. Somewhere in those mountains beyond the ridge where the tire tracks vanished lay the truth, and perhaps a child's final cry that no one wanted to hear. The road to Silver Hollow wound through a forest of frost-bitten pines, their dark needles whispering under the breath of the wind. The morning light had dimmed into a pale gray haze by the time Daniel Walker reached the old path with Lily Carter beside him and Max leading a few steps ahead. Snow dusted the earth like ash, and every branch seemed to lean inward, listening. Lily sat beside him in the truck's cab, clutching her gloves so tightly the seams creaked. Her face, pale beneath her chestnut hair, showed no trace of the tears she had shed the day before. Daniel could feel the tension in her silence. She wasn't built for danger, but grief had carved courage into her where fear used to be. Max barked once, low and sharp, as if to remind them they were not alone in the woods. The remains of Silver Hollow appeared suddenly between the trees, a ghost of metal and stone swallowed by decades of moss and fog. The entrance was a yawning tunnel framed by crumbling rock walls with rusted mining carts scattered like forgotten bones. Old signs leaned against broken fences, the letters half-eaten by time. Silver Hollow Mining Co. Closed since 1999. The place carried the smell of iron and damp earth, of something buried too deep for light to reach. Daniel turned off the engine and stepped into the brittle air, his boots sinking slightly in the frozen mud. He looked back at Lily, who hesitated near the truck, breath clouding before her. "You don't have to come," he said quietly. She shook her head. "If Emily's in there, I do." Max was already pacing near the entrance, his thick coat bristling, amber eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. Daniel crouched beside him, running a gloved hand down his neck. "Easy, boy," he murmured. "We move slow." The dog gave a short whine, part warning, part impatience. Together they advanced toward the gate, which hung half open on rusted hinges. Daniel examined the ground. The snow near the threshold had been disturbed. Footprints, heavy ones, and the faint pattern of tires. "Someone's been here recently," he said. Lily crouched beside him, touching one of the imprints. "These aren't old," she whispered. "Maybe a few days?" Daniel nodded grimly. "Or a few hours." They slipped inside, flashlights slicing through the blackness. The tunnel walls glistened with damp minerals, and the drip of water echoed from somewhere deeper. Daniel's breath fogged before him, mingling with the metallic tang of the air. "Stay close," he warned, voice low. The beam of his light passed over collapsed beams and rusted tools. Lily followed quietly, her boots crunching over gravel. "My father used to work here," she murmured, her voice trembling against the stillness. "He said it felt alive. The way the walls creaked, the way the air moved." Daniel gave a small nod. "Mines remember," he said. "Every sound, every secret." Max stopped suddenly, muscles tense, nose pressed to the ground near a small landslide of loose rock. He began to dig furiously, dirt scattering across Daniel's boots. "What is it?" Lily whispered. Daniel knelt, shining his light. Something pale glinted beneath the soil, a torn scrap of fabric, the corner of a jacket sleeve. He reached in, pulling gently until the earth released it. The fabric was small, patterned with pink flowers and streaked with dried brown stains. A few strands of golden-brown hair clung to it. Lily's hand flew to her mouth. "That's Emily's," she said, voice breaking. Daniel wrapped the fragment carefully in a handkerchief and slipped it into his pocket. "We don't know yet," he said softly, though he did. The look in Lily's eyes was the same look he had seen on too many battlefields, the fragile spark between hope and truth. The tunnel narrowed, bending left into a deeper chamber. A faint hum drifted from below, mechanical and steady, too rhythmic to be the wind. Daniel frowned, switching off his flashlight for a moment. The sound persisted, low electronic pulses like the muffled beat of a distant speaker. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Lily nodded, her face ghost-pale in the dim glow. Then, through the static rhythm came another sound, soft, uneven, and terribly human. It was the faint sob of a child. Lily froze. "That voice," she breathed. "Daniel, that's her. That's Emily." Daniel's instincts surged. "Stay behind me," he ordered, drawing the small handgun he carried for bears and worse. The tunnel widened into a cavern where broken rails disappeared into darkness. On the far side, a newer door had been installed, steel with a keypad glowing faintly red. "This isn't abandoned," he muttered. He crouched beside a discarded power cable snaking along the ground. "Someone's been using this place." Lily's breathing quickened, her eyes darting between the door and Daniel. "We have to open it." He shook his head. "Not yet. We don't know who's inside, or how many." Max stepped forward, pressing his nose to the gap under the door, then backed away with a growl, low and deep. Daniel knew that sound. It wasn't fear, but recognition of a threat. Somewhere beyond that metal door, people were moving. He could hear faint footsteps, the clatter of something metallic being dropped, then silence again. The hum of the generator deepened. Daniel's pulse synced with it, steady, unyielding. He glanced at Lily. "We're leaving," he said finally. She stared at him in disbelief. "Leaving? After hearing her?" "We're coming back prepared," he said firmly. "Whoever's down there doesn't want to be found. We'll need evidence, backup, light." Lily hesitated, tears glistening on her lashes. "You don't understand. If Emily's alive, then keeping you alive is how we find her," Daniel said quietly. They retreated through the tunnel, their footsteps echoing. Behind them, Max paused once, more at the edge of the dark, ears trained on the distant sob that faded into silence. Outside, the daylight felt foreign, harsh after the tomb-like chill of the mine. Daniel stood at the entrance, breathing in the cold, while Lily leaned against a boulder, shaking. He watched the fog roll down the mountain, swallowing the mouth of the mine again as if the forest itself wished to hide it. "We'll come back," he said finally, "but not alone." Max pressed against his leg, tail low, eyes fixed on the tunnel. Somewhere beneath their feet, secrets stirred, secrets that breathed and bled. By dawn, frost had crusted the truck's windshield, and Daniel Walker wiped it away with his sleeve before driving back toward Pine Creek. The forest behind him loomed like a warning. the memory of the mine's echoes still gnawing at his mind. Lily sat beside him, quiet, her hands wrapped around a thermos she hadn't touched. The bruised half-light of morning painted her face in shades of exhaustion. Max rested his head between the seats, eyes open, ears twitching with every sound outside. They hadn't slept, and neither spoke until the sheriff's office came into view, small and square beneath the rising fog. Inside, the same smell of stale coffee and dust lingered. Sheriff Harold Coleman looked up as Daniel entered, his pale eyes dull behind thick lids. But this time, something in him was different. More cautious, less dismissive. Daniel dropped a stack of photographs on the desk. Tire tracks, the torn fabric, the strange steel door buried inside Silver Hollow. "You said no one was missing," Daniel said evenly. "You lied." Coleman's lips tightened. "You don't understand what you're stepping into, Ranger." His voice was lower, the authority gone, replaced by something colder. "Walk away. Whatever you saw in that mine, forget it." Daniel leaned closer, his shadow falling across the desk. "A 12-year-old girl doesn't vanish into thin air." Coleman's gaze flicked toward the window as if afraid someone was watching. "You don't know who owns that land now," he said quietly, "and you don't want to." Then his expression hardened. "Leave it, Walker, for your sake and hers." The warning was real, and it came with fear. Back outside, Daniel found Lily pacing near the truck, the winter wind tangling her hair. "He's protecting someone," Daniel said, jaw set. Lily nodded grimly. Then, "We find out who." They drove to the town's records office, a small wooden building run by an older clerk named Mrs. Dalton, a frail woman with white hair pinned neatly beneath a scarf. She was nervous when Daniel mentioned the mine. "Those documents aren't public anymore," she stammered, pushing her glasses up her nose. Lily leaned forward, voice calm but firm. "Please, ma'am, it's about missing children." Mrs. Dalton hesitated, glancing at the door before sliding a folded ledger across the counter. "You didn't get this from me." Inside were records of recent property transfers. Silver Hollow had been purchased 8 months earlier by Reed Industrial Holdings, signed by Jacob Reed. Jacob Reed's name was familiar. Daniel remembered it from the local papers, owner of multiple timber and mineral operations across Colorado. Wealthy, untouchable, the kind of man who wore generosity like armor. But beneath the charity galas and public smiles, rumors whispered of forced buyouts, bribes, and workers who vanished after questioning safety conditions. Lily scanned the documents, lips tightening. "He owns half this town," she murmured, "and he's friends with the sheriff." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Then the law's off the table." He folded the papers carefully. "We find him another way." That afternoon, they parked outside Reed's estate, a sprawling house of dark wood and glass set on the edge of Pine Creek's western ridge. Snow blanketed the grounds, but tire marks curved toward the back where a line of black trucks sat half-hidden behind the garage. 2 armed guards in heavy jackets stood by the gate. One, a broad man with a scar under his left eye, lifted a gloved hand. "Private property," he barked. Daniel noted the patch on his shoulder. Reed's security division, not police. "Just taking a wrong turn," Daniel said easily, though his mind was racing. The guard's eyes lingered on Max before waving them off. As they drove away, Lily exhaled shakily. "He's guarding something." Daniel nodded. "Maybe everyone is." Later that night, back in Daniel's cabin, the fire crackled weakly as snow pressed against the windows. He laid the documents across the table, the pages fluttering in the draft. 4 missing girls, he said. Emily Carter, Grace Nolan, Hannah Miles, and Ruth Kelly, all from towns near the Reed operations. He traced his finger along the dates, each disappearance roughly 2 months apart. Lily sat opposite him, her hair loose, face drawn with fatigue. "Why take them?" she whispered. "Money, power," What's the reason? Daniel stared into the flames. Control. Some men can't stop building things even in the dark. Max lifted his head suddenly, ears pricked, growling low. Daniel rose, crossing to the door. Outside, the snow-covered clearing lay still, but faint tire marks glimmered under the moonlight, fresh ones leading toward the forest. Someone had been there. He felt the familiar tingle of danger, the same instinct that had kept him alive through war. "We're being watched," he said quietly. Lily's eyes widened. "By who?" "Reed's men, maybe. Or someone else." He turned back to Max. "Good boy. Stay sharp." The dog's tail lowered, his body tense as if scenting something just beyond the tree line. Morning came gray and heavy. Daniel decided to confront Coleman one last time. The sheriff met him outside the diner, his breath clouding in the cold. "You don't stop, do you?" Coleman muttered. His eyes were bloodshot, his voice cracking. "You think I like this? You think I wanted to play their game? Reed owns everything here. My salary, the judge, the goddamn paper." He rubbed a trembling hand over his face. "They've got something down there, Walker. Something they don't want the world to see." Daniel's tone hardened. "Children." Coleman's silence was answer enough. He turned away, shoulders hunched like a man already buried in his own guilt. As Daniel and Lily drove back toward the ridge, Max began growling again, staring out the window toward the tree line. The sound was different this time, angrier, deeper. Daniel stopped the truck. The air was still, yet the dog's hackles stood high. Then they heard it, a faint rumble beneath the earth, followed by a vibration that shuddered through the snow. "They're working underground," Daniel said, gripping the wheel. "The mine's alive again." Lily's voice broke into a whisper. "Then Emily might be too." Daniel looked toward the dark line of mountains, the same dread and resolve twined in his chest. "We go back," he said, "but not as guests." Snow fell in thin, silent veils over the mountains as night returned to Pine Creek. The world seemed to hold its breath beneath the weight of winter, the air cold enough to freeze thought itself. Daniel Walker stood by the truck, adjusting the strap of his worn backpack, the faint beam of a flashlight cutting through the white darkness. Behind him, Lily Carter wrapped herself tighter in a wool coat, her pale face half hidden by a scarf. Her eyes, green-gray and sleepless, fixed on the distant ridge where the mine lay, buried under shadow. "You're sure about this?" she whispered. Daniel's voice was low but steady. "We don't have time to wait. If Reed's moving people through that mine, every night matters." Max stood beside him, tail stiff, nose twitching toward the forest, his thick black and tan fur dusted with snow. The German shepherd was restless, pacing between the trees as though tracing the memory of something unseen. They were not alone this time. Ethan Brooks, the 12-year-old boy with sandy blonde hair and the courage of someone who had seen too much too young, had insisted on coming. "I know, a shortcut," he said, his breath puffing out in little clouds. Daniel had tried to refuse, but Ethan's wide, determined eyes mirrored the same resolve that had kept soldiers alive in darker places. "You stay behind me, no matter what," Daniel said, his tone carrying the weight of command. Ethan nodded, gripping a small flashlight in trembling fingers. They left the main road and followed Max through the undergrowth. The forest creaked around them, branches heavy with frost. Max moved with purpose, his paws crunching softly on the snow. Daniel trusted the dog's instincts more than his own compass. Near a fallen pine, Max stopped abruptly, ears high, tail frozen midair. He began digging furiously at a patch of ground covered in vines and dead leaves. Daniel knelt, clearing the debris with his gloved hands. Beneath the tangled roots lay a circular metal hatch, half buried and rimmed with rust. "He found something," Daniel murmured. Lily's flashlight flickered across the surface. There were new scratches on the latch, and the metal was still warm to the touch. "Someone used this recently," she said, her voice shaking. Daniel pulled a crowbar from his pack and pried the hatch open with a groan of strained metal. A gust of stale air rose from the darkness below, smelling faintly of oil and decay. One by one, they climbed down the narrow ladder into the tunnel. The walls were concrete, damp, lined with old wires and pipes. Somewhere far ahead, a dim yellow light pulsed faintly, rhythmic like a heartbeat. Their footsteps echoed, too loud in the silence. Daniel's breath came slow and even, his years of combat training guiding him through the claustrophobic dark. Lily followed close behind, her flashlight trembling slightly. "This wasn't part of the original mine," she whispered. "It's newer." Daniel nodded. "Which means it's being used." Max led the way, nose low to the ground, stopping every few feet to listen. The faint hum of machinery grew louder, mingling with the dripping of water and the faraway clank of metal. Then, without warning, Max froze. His ears shot up, muscles rigid, a deep growl rumbling in his throat. Daniel raised a hand, signaling for silence. A flicker of movement danced at the edge of the light. Before they could react, a voice barked sharply from the shadows, male, harsh, and close. "Hey, who's there?" A flashlight beam stabbed through the darkness, blinding them. "Run!" Daniel hissed. He grabbed Lily's arm, pulling her toward the ladder, but Ethan, startled, stumbled backward. A man in a dark uniform lunged from the corridor, grabbing the boy by the collar. "Got one!" the guard shouted, his face partly hidden by a black mask. Daniel swung his flashlight hard, striking the man across the temple. The guard staggered but didn't fall. Another beam of light flared deeper down the tunnel. More coming. "Go!" Daniel shouted, pushing Lily toward the exit. Max lunged, teeth bared, clamping down on the guard's sleeve, dragging him off balance. The man screamed, kicking wildly, but Max held on until Daniel pulled the dog back. In the chaos, Ethan's flashlight fell and rolled across the floor, its beam catching his terrified face as the second guard seized him and yanked him into the side passage. "Ethan!" Lily screamed, trying to break free. Daniel held her back, his voice hoarse. "We can't fight them all." She struggled, tears streaming, but the echo of the boy's cry was already swallowed by the tunnel. Max barked furiously at the darkness until his voice cracked. The sound of retreating footsteps and the clang of a distant door closing marked Ethan's disappearance. They scrambled up the ladder, the hatch slamming shut above them. Daniel pushed a boulder over the entrance, his breath ragged in the cold air. Lily collapsed beside the truck, sobbing into her scarf. "He's just a kid," she whispered. "We left him." Daniel knelt beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. His voice was quiet, but it trembled under the weight of guilt. "If we stayed, none of us would have made it out. They'll keep him alive, if only because they need leverage." Lily looked up, her face streaked with tears. "And Emily?" Daniel's gaze turned toward the distant ridge where the forest hid the mine like a wound beneath snow. "If Ethan's alive," he said, "then she might be too." They returned to the cabin before dawn. The fire inside had gone out, and the silence felt heavier than before. Daniel sat by the window, cleaning the cut on his hand, the memory of Ethan's cry echoing through his mind. Lily dozed fitfully on the couch, her face pale and drawn. Outside, Max refused to rest. The dog lay near the doorway, his body tense, eyes fixed on the distant mountains. Every few minutes he lifted his head and gave a low whine, as if listening for a voice only he could hear. When Daniel stepped outside to check on him, the dog turned his head toward the ridge and growled softly. A warning carried on his breath. Daniel followed the line of his gaze and saw nothing but darkness and snow. Yet, deep down, he felt it too, the certainty that something beneath the earth was moving, waiting, and that the night had only just begun to show its teeth. Snow tore across the mountains in thick, furious sheets, the kind of storm that erased tracks and swallowed sound. The wind howled against the cabin walls, rattling windows like the heartbeat of an approaching war. Daniel Walker fastened the straps of his old military parka, its faded green fabric torn at the seams but still serviceable. The faint light from the lantern glinted off the pistol holstered under his arm and the knife secured to his thigh. Across the room, Lily Carter stood by the fire, wrapping her scarf around her neck. Her face was pale and resolute, her eyes ringed by sleepless nights. "You don't have to go back," she whispered, though her tone carried no hope that he'd listen. Daniel looked at her, tired, scarred, but steady. "He's just a kid. I won't leave him down there." Outside, Max barked once, short and sharp, the sound slicing through the storm like a command. The German shepherd's fur bristled, and his amber eyes gleamed with purpose. They left at midnight when the world was blind with snow. The mountain path had nearly vanished beneath drifts of white, but Daniel knew the terrain better than anyone. He and Max led the way, Lily following close behind, clutching a flashlight against the wind. The cold stung like broken glass, but the storm was their ally, its roar masking their footsteps. When they reached the outskirts of Silver Hollow, Daniel motioned for silence. 2 guards stood near the entrance, huddled around a barrel fire, their rifles slung loosely over their shoulders. Daniel observed them carefully. One was tall, bearded, his breath steaming through the cold air. The other younger, his nose red from frost, the kind of man following orders without understanding them. Daniel slipped through the darkness, a shadow among shadows. With swift precision, he crept up behind the older guard and struck with the butt of his pistol, dropping him soundlessly into the snow. Max lunged at the second before he could shout, clamping down on his sleeve, forcing him to the ground. Within seconds, both men were unconscious, bound with zip ties Daniel had brought for this exact reason. They descended into the mine's main tunnel, the entrance swallowed behind them. Inside, the air was thick with damp metal and the low hum of hidden machines. Lily's breath came in shallow bursts, her flashlight trembling. "How do you know where to go?" she asked softly. Daniel glanced at Max, who was already sniffing the ground, tail rigid. "He does," Daniel answered. The dog moved with unerring confidence, leading them through narrow corridors lit only by flickering industrial bulbs. The walls gleamed with condensation, and the distant thud of machinery echoed like a heartbeat beneath the mountain. Every sound was magnified, every breath a risk. After several minutes, they reached a fork where the smell of oil grew stronger. To the left, Daniel saw heavy steel doors lined with keypads. He listened closely. Faint, breathing came from behind one of them. He signaled Lily to cover her ears, then aimed his pistol at the lock and fired once. The door jolted open with a metallic shriek. Inside, 3 girls huddled against the wall, their clothes torn, eyes wide with terror. One of them was Emily. Her freckles dim under the yellow light, her lips cracked but her spirit unbroken. "It's okay," Daniel said softly, lowering his weapon. "Your sister sent me." Lily rushed in, falling to her knees beside Emily, clutching her so tightly that both trembled. Tears froze on her cheeks as she whispered her sister's name over and over. From another room, a muffled cry reached Daniel's ears. He turned and kicked open the adjoining door. Ethan Brooks sat bound to a chair, his face pale, a bruise forming near his temple. When he saw Daniel, relief flooded his eyes. "I knew you'd come," he whispered hoarsely. Daniel cut the ropes with his knife and handed him a coat. "Can you walk?" The boy nodded weakly. "Good. Stay with Max." Daniel turned to Lily. "Take them. Head for the North Ridge. Follow the dog. He'll get you out." Lily's eyes widened. "What about you?" Daniel checked the safety on his pistol, then reached into his pack and pulled out a small bundle of explosives. "I'll give them something else to think about." Once they were gone, silence settled like a prayer. Daniel moved deeper into the tunnels, placing charges near fuel drums and support beams. He could already hear voices shouting, boots pounding against the floor. The guards had discovered the bodies above. "Time to move," he muttered, igniting the first fuse. A flash of light tore through the corridor as he sprinted for cover. Gunfire erupted behind him, bullets sparking off the walls. He fired back, hitting one silhouette before diving behind a generator. Pain exploded in his shoulder as a round grazed him, tearing through his jacket. Gritting his teeth, he pressed his hand against the wound, breath shallow but steady. "You've had worse," he told himself. Max's bark echoed faintly from the distance. One sharp, two short, the signal they had reached the surface. Relief cut through the pain. Daniel ducked into a side tunnel and triggered the detonator. The explosion ripped through the mine, sending tremors up the walls. Dust and flame surged through the corridors, swallowing the shouts of his pursuers. He staggered toward the exit, coughing through smoke, his vision blurring. The last thing he heard before collapsing near the outer shaft was the wail of sirens, faint but real, echoing through the storm. Outside, the blizzard raged on, its wind carrying the sound of distant chaos. In the glow of scattered headlights and drifting snow, Lily held Emily and the other girls close while Ethan leaned against a fallen tree, shaking but alive. Max paced near the ridge, ears twitching toward the mine's entrance, as if refusing to rest until Daniel returned. Then, faintly, a figure appeared through the smoke. Daniel, limping, his arms slick with blood, but his eyes sharp and unyielding. Max bolted forward, barking wildly, and the soldier's hand found the dog's fur. "It's done," Daniel rasped, voice rough from smoke. Above them, the first light of dawn broke through the storm clouds, painting the snow in a pale, forgiving gold. When the explosion shattered the night, Lily Carter had already made her choice. She left Daniel in the storm and drove through the mountain pass, her old pickup fighting against the wind like a wounded beast. Snow lashed against the windshield, visibility no more than a few feet, but she refused to stop. Her hands, red and raw on the steering wheel, trembled from exhaustion and fear. Every mile was a prayer. That she wasn't too late, that Daniel and the children were still alive. By the time the first faint glow of dawn crept over the peaks, she reached the nearest highway outpost. The man inside the small ranger station, Officer Miles, a tall, bearded man in his early 40s with tired brown eyes and a thick parka, looked up in alarm when she burst through the door, face pale and voice hoarse. "There's a mine," she gasped. "Children. They're being held there. Silver Hollow. Please, call the FBI." Miles hesitated for a heartbeat, reading the truth in her shaking hands, then grabbed the radio. "Get me Denver Field Command. Code Red." 2 hours later, black SUVs and snowplows carved their way through the blizzard. The convoy of federal agents, led by Special Agent Nora Kane, arrived at Pine Creek just as the fire from the explosion began to die down. Nora was in her late 30s, a woman of calm composure with sharp gray eyes, dark hair tied in a braid, and a no-nonsense posture that commanded attention. Her winter coat bore the frost of the storm, but her voice was steady as she spoke into her radio. "Secure the perimeter. No one in or out." When they reached the mine entrance, smoke still curled upward and the stench of burning diesel filled the air. Daniel was being carried out on a stretcher by paramedics, his face pale but conscious. Max trotted beside them, limping slightly, his fur streaked with soot. "He wouldn't leave him," one of the rescuers murmured, nodding toward the dog. "Stayed by his side the whole time." Inside the mine, the scene was chaos. Jacob Reed's private guards lay disarmed and handcuffed. Reed himself, a tall man with silvered hair, an immaculate coat torn at the sleeve, and the arrogance of someone used to power, was shouting as the agents pulled him to his feet. "You don't know what you're doing," he snarled, struggling against the cuffs. Nora Kane faced him calmly. "You're right," she said. "We don't know everything yet, but you're going to tell us." Sheriff Harold Coleman was found hiding near one of the supply rooms, his uniform stained with soot and shame. When Daniel, half awake on the stretcher, saw him being led out, their eyes met briefly, one filled with regret, the other with something like pity. Coleman lowered his gaze. the weight of his silence finally breaking him. By mid-morning, the children were airlifted to a hospital in Denver. Emily clung to Lily's coat as medics guided her onto the helicopter, her small hand never letting go of her sister's. Ethan Brooks sat beside her, wrapped in a blanket, his cheeks pale but eyes steady. "You're safe now," Lily whispered, brushing the boy's hair back. He managed a small smile. "You too." The elderly Mrs. Brooks waited at the landing zone, her wrinkled hands trembling as she held Ethan close. For the first time in months, she didn't have to tell him to stay quiet or keep his head down. The fear that had haunted their home had lifted with the snow. Later that afternoon, Daniel woke in a hospital room lit by soft golden light. The wound in his shoulder was bandaged, his arm strapped in a sling. Through the window he could see the endless white of the Rockies, sunlight glinting off the snow like shards of glass. Max lay at the foot of his bed, head resting on his paws, tail thumping lazily when Daniel stirred. Lily sat nearby, her hair loose, her face calm for the first time in days. "They got them all," she said quietly. "Reed, Coleman, everyone. The FBI's clearing the tunnels now?" Daniel exhaled, a slow, heavy breath. "How many made it out?" "All of them," she said. "Because of you." He gave a faint smile. "Because of us." Days later, when the federal agents finished their investigation, the town began to stir from its long silence. Newspapers called it the Silver Hollow Scandal. Reporters swarmed Pine Creek, but Daniel avoided them all. Instead, he spent his mornings outside the cabin, his shoulders still healing, throwing a stick for Max to fetch across the frozen clearing. The townsfolk who once crossed the street to avoid him now waved as they passed. Sheriff Coleman resigned before his trial, and Jacob Reed was charged with kidnapping, conspiracy, and multiple counts of illegal confinement. The people of Pine Creek learned, at last, to speak again, to look truth in the face without flinching. One morning, a government SUV pulled into Daniel's driveway. Agent Nora Kane stepped out, her expression softer than before. "The state's offering you a position," she said. "Forest management. You already do the job unofficially. Might as well make it official." Daniel looked past her toward the trees, sunlight spilling through the branches. For the first time in years, he felt no weight on his chest. "I'll think about it," he said. Nora smiled. "That's a yes." Before leaving, she bent to scratch Max behind the ears. "You, too, hero." Max barked once, tail wagging as if acknowledging the title. The following morning, the storm finally broke. The sky was a pale, endless blue, and the world below glimmered with untouched snow. Daniel stood at the edge of the frozen lake with Lily and Max beside him. The sunlight turned the ice into gold, and for a moment, the silence was peaceful. Not the silence of loneliness, but of calm after survival. Lily glanced at him, her breath visible in the cold air. "What now?" she asked. Daniel watched Max trot toward the water's edge, tail high, leaving a trail of prints across the snow. "Now," he said quietly, "we live." The wind stirred the pine branches, carrying the scent of new beginnings across the valley. The war inside him, after all these years, was finally over. Sometimes God doesn't stop the storm. He walks with us through it. Daniel's courage, Lily's faith, and Max's loyalty remind us that miracles often come in the form of love, strength, and hope that never gives up. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, and share it to spread faith and kindness. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of hope. May God bless you and protect you through every storm of life.